Malachi Hamnachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Seitchem Shalom, Malachi HaShalom, Malachi Elyon. Mihi Melech, Malachi Hamnachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Continue with the kindling of our Shabbat lights on pages 2 and 3. And it's a pleasure to be able to invite Sally Weiner and Selena Schreiber, who are regulars at our Talmud study class on Thursdays, to kindle and bless our Shabbat candle.
As these Shabbat candles give light to all who behold them, so may we, by our lives, give light to all who behold us. As their brightness reminds us of the generations of Israel who have kindled light, so may we, in our own day, be among those who kindle light.
O source of light and truth, creator of the eternal law of goodness, help us to find knowledge by which to live. Lead us to take the words we shall speak into our hearts and into our lives. Bless all who enter this sanctuary in need, all who bring the offerings of their hearts. May our worship lead us to acts of kindness, peace, and love. No, use this one.
It's already lit. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, tzivanu l'chadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Shabbat Shalom. You know, the whole point of Kabbalat Shabbat, of the opening songs and psalms, is to give everyone a little space just to settle in, and sometimes even the rabbi needs that. It's good to be together. We're going to continue to welcome in the Shabbat Pride with Lecha Dodi on page 20, and we'll join in verses 1, 2, 5, and 9. On that last verse, if you'd like, and if you're able, you can rise as we bring in Shabbat.
Lecha Dodi likrat kala, v'nei Shabbat nekabela. 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 Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, Ishmi'anu el ha'meyuchad. Adonai echad u'shemo echad, l'shemo tiferet v'litila. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, v'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, v'nei Shabbat nekabela. לקראת שבת לך
ובנך, כי מקור הברכה, מראש מקדם נסוכה, סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה.
לך דודי לקראת כלה,
פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. התעוררי, התעוררי, כי באורך ומיורי, אורי, אורי, שיר דברי, כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. בואי ושלום את אתבלה, גם בשמחה ובצולה, תוך אמוני עם סגולה.
בואי חלה, בואי חלה.
לך דודי, לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. We turn now to page 26 as we move into our formal beginning and call to prayer. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ועמד יברח חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בגלה בגלה, ובזמן קריב וימרו אמן. יהי שמירה במבורך, לעולם עולם מעמיה. יתברך, יתברך וישתבח, ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירן בעלמה, ויאמרו אמן. Page 30, we join in our prayer for creation and the changing of day into night. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim, Bechokma poteach sha'arim, uvitvuna mishane itim, umachalif et hazmanim, umesader et hakochavim, b'mishmerotehem barakia kirtsono. Bore yom v'layla, golel or mipnei choshech, v'choshech mipnei or. Umavir yom umevi laila, umavdil ben yom uven laila, Adonai tzevaot shemo, El chai v'kayam, tamid yimloch aleinu leolam va'ed, Baruch ata Adonai, Ha'ma'ariv aravim. Let's join in the English on page 32. Everlasting love, you offered your people Israel by teaching us Torah and mitzvot, laws and precepts. Therefore, Adonai, our God, when we lie down and when we rise up, we will meditate on your laws and your commandments. We will rejoice in your Torah forever. Day and night we will reflect on them, for they are our life, and doing them lengthens our days. Never remove your love from us. Praise to you, Adonai, who loves your people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Please be seated. We'll continue on page 36. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha v'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol meodecha v'hayu ha'devarim ha'eleh asher anochi mitzavecha Hayom alevavecha veshinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shivtecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha v'aderech uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם. אמת. And we turn to pages 40 and 41. Please join with me if you'd like these words leading into Micha Mocha. Sing the song of men and women joined in understanding and respect, the song of God's miracles, an earth protected and cherished, a gift for our children and the generations to come, the song of a land once ravished by war, now quiet and content, her soldiers home to leave no more, the song of a world redeemed, the song of peace.
Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi
kamocha nedar b'kodesh, mi Chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi. Kamocha nedar b'kodesh. Nora tehilot osef ele. Nora tehilot osef ele.
Mi.
Chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi. Kamocha nedar b'kodesh. Malechutecha ra'u vanecha. Bokei hayam lifnei Moshe Miriam. Ze Eli anu ve'ameru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed mi. Chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi. Kamocha nedar b'kodesh mi. Chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi. Kamocha nedar b'kodesh. V'namar kifad Adonai et Yaakov. Ugalo miyad chazak mimenu. Baruch atah Adonai. Ga'al Yisrael. On page 42, as we join in Hashkivenu this evening, like last Shabbat, we just draw special attention to people of Ukraine who are in need of shelter and safety. We especially pray for our Jewish brothers and sisters and for all Ukrainian people in need of safety and shelter. Pray that God will spread over all of us God's shelter of peace. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomrei nu lechaim. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomrei nu lechaim. Ushmor tzedkenu uvoenu lechaim u'shalom me'ata ve'ad olam. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomrei nu lechaim. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom v'hamidenu shomrei nu lechaim. Page 44, celebrate the gift of Shabbat. How good it is for those of you in our sanctuary. It's so good to be together and extending Shabbat wherever we may be this evening. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ. וביום השביעי Shabbat vayi nafash, uvayom hashvi'i, Shabbat vayi nafash. We rise now in body or in spirit. Page 46, as we enter into our tefillah, we'll begin together and then take a few moments to add the prayers from our hearts.
Adonai sifatai tiftachu fi agiteilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, v'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, Ve'konei Hakol, Ve'zocher Chasdei Avot ve'imahot, Umevi Geola livnei v'nehem, Lema'an Shemo be'ahava, Melech Ozer u'Moshiach u'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah, Atah Gibor le'olam Adonai, Mechaye hakol atah Rav lehoshia, Mashiv haruach u'morid hagashem, Mechakel chayim bechesed, Mechaye hakol berachamim rabim, Somech noflim v'rofech olim, Umatir asurim, Umekayem emunato, Lishenei afar, Michamocha b'gevurot, Umidom elach, Melech memit umechayeh, Umatzmiach Yeshua, V'ne'eman atah lahachayot hakol, Baruch atah Adonai, Mechayeh hakol. Atah kadosh v'shimcha kadosh, U'kdoshim b'chol yom yehalelucha selah. Baruch atah Adonai, Ha'el HaKadosh. Blessed are you, Adonai, the holy God. I invite you to continue silently, and please feel free to be seated when you're ready.
we'll come back together on page 62. We take this moment in our service to add our prayer for health and healing on page 253 as we pray for any loved ones who are ill at this time and pray for those who care for them as well. We are especially thinking of these members of our community: Colin Monroe, Mary Lou Hole, Janet Watson, Paul Robillard, Elizabeth Hill, Enrico Mascaro, Deborah Booker, Benjamin Horowitz, Bradley Dichter, Mateo Goldman, Toby Weiner, Esya Rushovskaya, Amy Fasper-Kurtz, Eileen Arnone, Marilyn Breyer, Jean Sands, Roseanne Cohen, Tom Fiorino, Barry Levine, Carolyn Weil, Gary Bacalar, John G., Harvey Grassfield, Stephen Driscoll. If there are other names that you'd like to mention out loud, you may do so. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, bless those in need of healing with refuah shelema, the renewal of body, the just as a segue out of our prayer for healing before study, in this time of adding blessings, we know we said Shehachianu last week, but we know for some of you it's kind of your first time back in a while. So our blessing for first, and we know it's not a first, but Jewish tradition says if you haven't seen someone in 30 days, you say Shehachianu. So for those who maybe haven't seen each other, let's join together. And of course, with our past president, David Wang here, who always reminds us of these moments. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh.
And it's truly a Shechianu moment to have a scholar in residence in person in 2 years, and that's special. It is worthy of a lot of joy and gratitude. All the more so to have Rabbi Neil Gold with us. On a personal note, Rabbi Karen and I count among our mentors a few, Rabbi Dennis Eisner, Rabbi Yoshi Zweibeck, and of that generation for many, many years, there was also Rabbi Neil Gold, who we had not met until we brought him to Tulsa to be scholar in residence. And so when we learned from him, we added him to that list of mentors, even though, given he's dear friends with Yoshi and Dennis, he was there all along for us.
And fortunately, Temple Beth David is a lot closer for you than Tulsa, Oklahoma.
And that's right. I understand Logan wasn't too bad to get from Natick to here. Oh, good. So it's wonderful. Neil is a neighbor. He's in our area. Neil teaches and writes about Jewish texts, Israel, and intersections between Jewish spiritual life and the contemporary world. Recently, in 2020, he created a rapidly expanding online platform for adult Jewish learning called A Tree with Roots. And he also teaches for Mea, and this congregation is so Mea rich. Just raise your hand if you've participated in Mea. Look at that. And that's in no small part, of course, to Rabbi Emeritus Hank Zub, who is just builds Torah students and grows Torah students wherever he goes, and certainly here for decades. Rabbi Gold is also the Jewish chaplain and Hill director at Babson College and the immediate past president of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis. Rabbi Gold received Smicha rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and in 2018 he also received a second master's degree in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University. He's the author of many academic and popular writings about Judaism and Israel, and is the editor of Radiance, the collected prose and poetry of Danny Siegel. For over 18 years, Rabbi Gold served congregations in New Jersey and Massachusetts. He also served as the director of content and programming for Arts of the Association of Reformed Zionists of America, and was a delegate at the 37th World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem. And all of his writings and bloggings can be found at www.neilgold.net. Also, A Tree with Roots. If you Google that, I think you'll find Rabbi Gold's writing. And you are in Natick, right? Oh, it is the same thing. You're in Natick, right? That's where you... Rabbi Gold lives in Natick with his wife Heidi and his kids Avi and Jeremy, and he enjoys fishing, writing, Talmud, playing bass guitar. We should have had you brought your bass, yoga, and highly amplified music. That's the best. Neil, it's wonderful to welcome you to Temple Beth David. Thank you.
Don't oversell it. Don't oversell it. Shabbat Shalom. The first thing I'm going to do is this. It's like pulling off ski boots. It is wonderful to be here with you tonight, but let's be honest, it's wonderful to be anywhere. So I'm really, really happy to be at Temple Beth David with all of you, and I want to express some words of gratitude first and foremost to my friends, Rabbi Micah, Rabbi Karen Citron. You heard what Rabbi Micah said in his introduction. I feel exactly the same way. I'm grateful for their longstanding friendship, for their collegiality, for their invitation to be here tonight. It is wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to see the two of you leading the davening in such a rich and spiritually meaningful way. It's really a privilege to praise with all of you in this holy community tonight. And I sincerely hope Temple Beth David knows what jewels the two of them are for this community. I know you do. And I'm so happy to see my friend Rabbi Hank Zub here. I didn't get to greet you at the beginning of the service, but it's always wonderful to see you. And I am so grateful to you for being such a pillar of our Jewish community. I have a personal appreciation for Rabbi Zub because I have two graduates of the Rashi School, of which he is the pillar of that community as well. And some other friends to say thank you to as well for bringing me here and welcoming me tonight. I'm very grateful to Mark Albion, whom it's my pleasure to study with, like throughout this pandemic, online, of course. And am I doing okay? I'm sorry. Okay, great. I should always check. I got to tell you, being a hearing impaired person, I'm always really sensitive to the sound system. So if you can't hear me, please tell me, especially as I start to move around a little bit too. Thank you. I was thanking Mark, but you know what I wanted to say. I'm so grateful to be here. It's wonderful to see you in person and to learn with you. And I also want to express thanks to Mark Beal as well, whom is also a friend of mine through online Torah study. My gratitude to you. Where's Mark? Oh, there you are. My gratitude to you, Mark, and to the entire adult learning community here for bringing me tonight. Okay, so Rabbi Micah's passed around some texts that we're going to share. All of you who are online tonight, I'm so delighted that you're joining us. I'm not 100% sure how the technology is working, if you're going to be able to see these texts, but I believe that you are, and I'm glad. We're going to get to them in a moment or two. But let me say some words of introduction, including a story that I learned this week, like many others, including perhaps some of you in the room. This week I learned the story of a Ukrainian rabbi and his family. The rabbi's name is Menachem Borodkin. I didn't know of him before this week, but maybe you heard his story as well. The Borodkin family, Rabbi Menachem, his wife Rivka, and a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. They lead a Chabad boarding school and camp for Ukrainian Jewish children. And the family fled Ukraine last week in the face of the Russian invasion. Many of their students had already left town, but there were six girls in the school who were unable to get home. And the family, as they were fleeing Ukraine, intending to go to Israel, they took these 6 girls from the community with them. Their intention was to travel to Romania, where with the help of the Jewish Agency, there were direct flights on El Al from Bucharest to Tel Aviv. But when they arrived at the border of Moldova, 2 of the girls announced that they didn't have their passports with them. They had left them back at home and back in their hometowns. And the family was a little bit stuck. They managed to get refugee passes, but were refugee visas, but they were unable to go to Romania. So they traveled to the capital of Moldova, Chisinau, where there's an Israeli embassy. Now, if you know your Ashkenazi Jewish history, Chisinau is more familiar to us by the name Kishinev. Kishinev, which was the site of devastating pogroms in 1903 and 1905, massacres that entered the Jewish imagination and Jewish literature and the immortal poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik. And as my friend, who we've already invoked once tonight, Rabbi Yoshi Zweibeck, first told me about the Borodkins, he wrote this week, "There is now an Israeli embassy in Chisinau, a city in which just a century ago Jews could be slaughtered at will. In Chisinau, Israeli officials provided the girls and the entire Borodkin family with emigration visas to Romania, and they got on an El Al flight and arrived last week in Tel Aviv in time to light the Shabbos candles. An unbelievable story of deliverance from oppression. Al kanfei nisharim, on eagle's wings, as the Torah says. I'm thinking about that story tonight because as Rabbi Micah and I conceived of this weekend, he invited me to speak about one of my several proposed topics. He said, let's talk about when the stranger resides among us. Who is the biblical ger? And it's a favorite topic of mine, and I think it is one of the essential underpinnings of Jewish ethics. How we treat not only our neighbors and our friends and our family, but the stranger, the minority in our midst. And certainly neither Rabbi Micah nor I at that time predicted Putin's assault on Ukraine, which is, of course, on all of our minds. And it changes the nuance of my topic for tonight, because in the faces of the refugees from Ukraine, we need to see not just a contemporary human rights crisis, but also an echo of our past, of our stories. The familiarity and the awareness of these images and these stories, they strike such a deep and resounding note within us. Why? Because we've seen these faces before. We know these stories. So I want to make some of those connections tonight as we consider the story of the biblical ger. Time and again in the Torah, we are taught to love the ger who is in our midst, so we should take a moment to define our terms. What is the biblical ger? Ancient Israel knew three designations of people in their communities, at least three. There was the Ezrach. If we were in the classroom, I'd be writing on the board right now, but the Ezrach, which means the full-fledged citizen of ancient Israel. Then there's the ger, the resident minority who finds herself living among us. We'll flesh it out a little bit in a few moments. And the third category is the nochri. Nochri means foreigner, somebody who is temporarily residing outside of his community and visiting ours, a tourist, we might say, or someone visiting on business, or lots of other reasons. Each of these categories seems familiar to us today. The citizen, the visitor, and in between, the resident alien. It's that middle category, the ger, who I want us to explore. Old translations of the Torah used to use the word stranger, although that word always struck me as kind of missing the point a little bit. A person might be intimately familiar with a person who's a ger. They're not necessarily a stranger in the sense of, hi, stranger, I've never met you before. Resident alien seems to get a little closer to the idea. Someone who's not an Israelite, but in the Torah's context, lives amongst the community and may continue to be here for a long, long time. And among other things, among ways of thinking of this person, we might think of a refugee, as in someone who sought refuge to be among us for reasons that will hopefully become clear as we examine some of the Torah sources. So tonight, what I propose that we do, now that I've been speaking from the podium for a few minutes, is in fact that we treat the sanctuary as classroom, and we look at some of the texts on the sheets that have been distributed. Texts from throughout Jewish history. Don't worry, we're not going to look at all of these texts tonight. It's my MO, Mark will affirm, that I give you a lot more than I'm planning to actually discuss in class, and I hope you'll take the sheets home and study them over Shabbat lunch, and then it makes your whole Shabbat experience more meaningful. But let's take a look at page 1, because the first category of texts I want us to take a look at are the Torah's narratives, the passages from Genesis and Exodus, and see what these have to say, how they can clarify this question of who the biblical ger, what's going on in the Torah's discussion. Now, Passover is just a few weeks away. I say that with no sense of horror or foreboding or the amount of cleaning that has to go on in my house. And two sections from Genesis and Exodus in front of us tell us something about the Passover experience, the migratory experience in the Torah, is, it's part and parcel of who we are as a people. Now, as those who have studied with me before know, sometimes I get tired just as quickly as you might of my hearing my own voice. So I would love to, if we could turn this room into a classroom a little bit. I'd like to have volunteers to take turns reading some of the texts that we're going to look at. And also, like I say, in the spirit of being a classroom, I do invite questions and comments and insights as we go through some of these texts that we're going to share together. That sound okay to everybody?
And and I'm going to bring the microphone around so folks can read it. I neglected to mention that if you're
Great.
if you're at home, there is a link on our website to these texts, so you can join us in the study. So I'm going to Phil Donahue this for those of you who remember who Phil Donahue is, and get the mic to everyone.
Great,
So,
thank you.
good.
So is there a volunteer who'd like to, with a nice, loud, clear voice, would like to read some text in English for us in the room? Please. So the first text we're going to look at, I don't think needs much of an introduction. It's at the top of the page, text number 1, from Genesis chapter 15. Maybe I'll just take 1 second and say Genesis chapter 15 is the story of Abraham, very early in Abraham's career. In fact, he's not Abraham yet. He's still Avram. His name hasn't been changed by God yet. So God and Abraham are still sort of getting to know one another at this point, and Abraham is new to all of this, founding a people and a religion sort of thing. And as you'll see, God is going to reveal to Abraham in this passage a little bit about what's going to happen in the future to this nation that Abraham is destined to be the ancestor of. Go ahead, back there. Thank you.
As the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Avram, and a great dark dread descended upon him. And God said to Avram, "Know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth."
Great, thank you. What's your name?
Paul.
Paul, thank you. So, Rabbi Micah, just linger back there because I'm going to ask Paul to read another text in a moment as well. But let's talk about what Paul just read for us. In this passage, God and Abraham, as they're developing their relationship one another and getting to know one another, God makes a bit of a foreshadowing, a prediction for Abraham that his descendants are going to be Gerim. It says, Yadoa teda ki ger yiyeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem. Know that your offspring will be Gerim, or I told you about the old translation, that strangers, resident aliens in a land that doesn't belong to them. They're going to be a minority people in somebody else's culture. This is the prediction long before Joseph comes down to Egypt, long before the story of bondage and ultimately of Passover's freedom. God anticipates that Abraham's descendants will be in Egypt. It says, in a land not theirs. It seems that the incubation of the Jewish people will take place living in a foreign land, and that there they will cultivate a deep identification with what it means to be a ger, to be a minority in somebody else's place. That's going to be the gestation of the Jewish people. We tend to forget this. It's a slightly, if anything in Genesis can be obscure, it's a slightly obscure passage. We kind of forget this when we tell the Passover story to one another. And if we had forgotten it, it's going to keep coming back. Because in the next text we're going to see is, now we're in Exodus chapter 2, and it's the story of Moses. With the Moses story, this is the chapter, Exodus chapter 2, where Moses becomes Moses. It was Abraham becoming Abraham. Moses becomes Moses. He's fled from Egypt, and he finds himself in the kingdom of Midian. And in Midian, he marries, he starts a family, he even goes to work for his father-in-law. And we'll see what happens. Paul, if you would, thank you.
Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why did you leave the man? Ask him in to break bread." Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Tzipporah as wife. She bore a son whom he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land."
Great. So I put these two texts together because it's almost like in the Moses story, the prophecy of the Genesis story comes true right here. Moses puts a name on it. I have been a ger in this place, and he even names his son Gershom, which in a little internal midrash in the Torah, it's not literally what the word Gershom means, but the Torah does midrash with itself sometimes and says Gershom means Gershom. I was a ger there in that place. I think I'd like to hear your comments and insights about this. I'd like to say that I think that part of what makes Moses so fascinating, in fact, kind of what makes Moses Moses, is that he's not from anywhere, that he's sort of the ultimate boundary crosser. He doesn't fit into Israelite culture because he's not a slave, and he never had the mentality of slavery. But he doesn't fit into Egyptian culture because the text in an earlier part of the chapter tells us that he leaves Pharaoh's palace and goes out to his people, as if to say the Egyptians were never his people. And then he flees to Midian, and he certainly isn't a Midianite. So who is he anyway? Maybe it's this outsiderness that Moses carries in his identity that makes Moses Moses. Anybody have any insights or comments that they want to make about that? Yep.
Wait, Cynthia, hold on.
When you are new in a place, you work at being a friend to everyone and reaching out to people because you don't know when you're going to need them. When Harv and I were first met, we had 4 kids in 4 different states, so we were always a new person. And when you're having a baby in a new place, believe me, you reach out to your neighbors because you don't have family. And you find that everybody is in the same spot. And it doesn't hurt to reach out. And by the time you reach out, you find that everybody's reaching out to you. And you don't need to be from any place. You just need to be a mensch. And you need to share whatever you have.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Subject to, oh, thank you, I forgot. My apologies. You're also vulnerable to the goodwill of the people in the community you find yourself. Now, if it's a warm and opening place, Temple Beth David, then that's great. Or if it's a cold and closed off, walled off kind of place, then you're a little bit shakier ground. So there's something about being that ger that makes you vulnerable. And what you said that I want to lift up, because we're going to come back to it, is it also makes you empathetic to others because you realize that others have felt that way too. And that's why I think that there's something about these two stories that are important for starting this conversation, because the Abraham story says there's going to be something about the people of Israel, that this is going to be endemic to who they are, and that in the story of Moses, something about Moses in his outsiderness that makes him who he is in order to become the leader that he becomes, in order to become the deliverer of the Torah that he's ultimately going to be. Okay, let's look at a little bit more. Let's flip the page. The subsequent texts that I want to share with you are from, there it is, from the legal sections of the Torah. Not so much stories anymore, but now the laws that the Torah presents throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This self-awareness that we've been talking about is affirmed in the legal parts of the Torah, which kind of say that there needs to be equality under the laws that the Torah legislates, at least under the civil laws that the Torah legislates. The Torah still is going to recognize that in ritual law, there's going to be a difference between the Israelite citizen and the ger among them. But as far as civil laws, as far as a just society goes, the Torah is going to say there can't be a difference. In other words, why might a ger be vulnerable? Because by definition, the ger doesn't have local family or legal ties. He couldn't fall back on the social and legal protections that existed in the ancient Near East. He was vulnerable to the goodwill of the people around him. So famously, the commandment to protect the ger isn't mentioned once or twice in the Torah. It's the most frequently mentioned mitzvah in the entire Torah. It appears in every book of the Torah. It's repeated far more frequently than the Torah says observe Shabbat or keep kosher or anything like that. And I just have a couple of examples of it to share with you on the page. But how about the next text? And we'll call on somebody else who'd like to read for us. The next text should be familiar at the top of page 2. It's Exodus chapter 20. And even if you don't know what Exodus chapter 20 is, as soon as you start reading it, it's going to be very familiar. Another volunteer to read for us, please. Great, thank you. So what's Exodus chapter 20? Exodus chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. And one of the Ten Commandments is, one of the most familiar is, what's your name?
Connie. I guess I should take my mask off.
Tell me your name.
Connie.
Connie, great. Thank you, Connie. Go ahead.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of Adonai your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days God made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and God rested on the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Great, thank you. I'll make the point, but I also want to make an aside too. You did great, Connie, because I wanted to point out that when I put together texts like this, I always kind of wrestle with what I want to do with God's name, the four-letter name of God in Torah. It always, the Lord doesn't quite work for us in 21st century context. It's kind of hard to figure. So I cheat a little bit. I just put YHVH, Yud Hey Vav Hey in the Hebrew, and leave it up to readers like Connie to deal with it and figure out how they want to refer to God. Adonai, God, whatever makes you comfortable. The reason I put the text there is to draw out that statement of right there in the heart of the Ten Commandments. We have, you shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your cattle, or the stranger who is in your settlements, lest you thought that the mitzvah of Shabbat excludes the ger from Shabbat's blessing, lest you think that refraining from work is a luxury only for the Jews in the Torah's milieu. The Torah comes along to say, no, that right to not define yourself as by working 24/7 all week long, all year long, that right belongs to everybody in your midst. It's not an exclusive privilege of the people of Israel. I think it's an important one. And we can go through law after law in the Torah that defines itself this way. For instance, Connie, if you do one more for us, a little bit more obscure, in Numbers chapter 35, there's a very interesting ancient rule about setting up when the Israelites come in and occupy their ancestral land, that Moses is instructed to set up 6 arei miklat, cities of refuge, which is exactly what they are. They're places that somebody who inadvertently takes another person's life, a manslayer, who did it inadvertently, needs a place to run. Why? Because the ancient Middle East, and frankly the modern Middle East too, has this idea of personal retribution, of family honor, so somebody who accidentally committed a terrible accident and took somebody's life could be vulnerable to attacks from that person's family. But there's these cities of refuge to which a person can flee. It's a phenomenal, fascinating, unique institution in the Torah. And Connie will read one short passage about the cities of refuge.
3 cities shall be designated beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 shall be designated in the land of Canaan. They shall serve as cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall serve the Israelites and the resident aliens among them for refuge, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there.
There's lots of other examples I could have drawn on, but I just took these 2, Shabbat and the cities of refuge, to show that there's a whole bunch of others. The degree to which the Torah goes to say these civil laws that we've created that protect society, that make society better, that give everybody these equal rights that you're expected. Well, in the words of the text we skipped over, Leviticus says you have one standard for the ger and for the ezrach alike, which is kind of beautiful and kind of inspiring and kind of aspirational, because are we living in a society like that yet? I'd say not quite. Oh, sure, everybody knows to assert equal rights for every citizen in the community, but you think about the plight of the ger, whoever the ger might be, in our own contemporary American society, and you know that we have a way to go to live up to the aspirations that the Torah sets for us. In fact, the Torah is going to go one step beyond. It's one thing to say equal rights, equal law, no different laws for citizens versus the stranger, the minority in the midst. But it goes one step further. The Torah is going to tell us in a whole slew of other places to love the ger. There's a strong impulse throughout the Torah to give us the letter of the law, but then also to go beyond the letter of the law, to enact something a little bit stronger about the spirit that's behind it, which is inspirational to us. But at the same time, we say, are we really able to look into the faces of refugees who come across our border and love them? Is that really what the Torah expects of us? So let's look at, you trust me that there's plenty of examples we can draw on. Let's just look at one. Let's look at Leviticus again at the bottom of page 2. This is Leviticus 19, and just 2 verses from that. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Micah, since you're right there by Connie, can we give you one more to read for us? And that's the one at the bottom of the page, Leviticus 19.
Number 4.
I'm sorry?
Number 4.
Yes,
Okay.
it is in fact.
When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, Adonai, am your God.
So what's going on in a passage like this? Does the Torah really expect us to love somebody who has come into our town unexpectedly, is lingering there? Is that really what the Torah expects of us when it says love the stranger as yourself? Well, the Torah could say treat them with respect as a person, you know? I mean, is it just hyperbole, do you think? What's your name? Sandra, do you think it's just, Torah can speak in hyperbole sometimes. Is that what's going on? I don't know. Well, and someone behind you too, Sandra.
I just really was curious how they would describe a citizen. We know that in the United States,
Well, I
in the
think-
beginning, you had to be landed. You had to have, it was separate. It wasn't just someone who was there. It, so what did they mean by citizen?
So in the Torah sense, the Torah is not going to make this easy for us, because in the Torah sense, it simply means member of the people of Israel. And in its context, in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, we're still talking about a tribal community, someone who's part of the family. We call ourselves B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel. We sometimes forget that it's called the children of Israel because you go back to Genesis and it starts as a family. We're literally the children of a guy named Israel, who was Jacob, right? So the question, a 21st century question of who's a citizen is not going to be the same as the question in Exodus. Who's going to say, who's part of this family? Who's part of this covenanted community called the Jewish people? But what's going on? I'm going to share with you two possible interpretations of what it possibly means to say love, unless, Mark, you were going to answer my question.
No.
Is that why you have the microphone?
You want to just keep going.
Okay. I always love learning from you. Don't hold back on me, Mark. I love learning from you.
I'll make it quick. I won't get the whole question. Ager, when I was listening to Cynthia speak about moving around and those kinds of things, what I thought of was social capital. That a ger sounds to me like someone who doesn't have any social capital. By social capital, I mean all those bonds, all those connections. We talk about it a lot today with African Americans, particularly when you look at the assets that they have, which is next to nothing. And they have, actually, Chris Rabb from Yale wrote an excellent book called Social Capital, about social capital with blacks, and how that just doesn't allow you to have the same traction, particularly in a society where land is critical, agriculture. You don't have any of that. So do you think there's a connection in terms of today? You're asking about who's that. I could say African Americans, they're the ger. They live amongst us, but they don't have the social capital that non-African Americans have.
I think that's beautiful. The ethics behind it, I 100% agree with. It might be midrash, though. I mean, look, African-American family, there are African-American families who have been in this country a lot longer than my family's been here, by a couple of generations. But about social capital part, yeah, I'm right there with you, that the idea is, especially in the ancient Near East, the idea was the citizen's got family, it's got connections, it's got legal protections, and the ger in the community's got none of those things, and is therefore vulnerable. No social capital, as you say. But yeah, Rabbi.
Well, I think you were about to talk about, so what is this ger get, or the position, and I would just throw one thing to out that I think is challenging, and I'm curious about your thoughts on it, which would be, in Exodus, talking about the Passover, the whole community of Israel shall offer it, and we already know that there's one law, the ger should not eat leavened bread, just like the Israelite. But then it goes on to say, if a male stranger who dwells with you would offer the Passover to the Eternal, all his males must be circumcised. Then he shall be admitted to offer it. He shall then be as a citizen of the country. So it would suggest that if you are a ger and you are not circumcised, you are not able to offer the Passover sacrifice. And of course, we know that Torah is contradictory. There's other places where if it's a Moabite ger, they're not going to be allowed into the place of worship, the place that God sets up, right? Because in Deuteronomy it says, don't let the Moabite in for X number of generations.
Yeah.
So how do we square those two things? One, law, and treating the ger with love, and at the same time these, basically saying, well, you need to.
So we're not going to get too esoteric too much, okay? But
that's fine.
Let's talk
But
about
you
this
see the distinction.
that I do think. First of all, I tried to differentiate earlier between, there's a difference between civil law, the rights and protecting, the stranger, and the ritual laws, which do seem to be predicated on the idea that you're part of the covenanted people of Israel who came out. Um, so the Passover sacrifice, which is not the same as the Seders that we hold, specifically the Passover sacrifice in Exodus, I think is very much a defining ritual act about what it means to be somebody who carries the name Israel. And the interesting thing about the circumcision and stuff they point out is not everybody was automatically part of that community, but the boundary was porous, that somebody could, even from the earliest generations, could choose to join the people of Israel, could cast their lot with the people of Israel, and then partake of the, and once upon so doing, their descendants would be part of that people as well. See, there's something really amazing, though, Rabbi, and there's a passage in Ezekiel where Ezekiel universalizes this vision and looks towards this like messianic idealized future. And in these passages from Ezekiel, he says we're going to go back and people are going to return to their tribal lands in the land of Israel, and the ger is going to have allotted land in the land of Israel as well, and doesn't have to convert or anything. It says there's going to be a place in Israel for the ger to own as well, just like the 12 tribes. Ezekiel is wild because Ezekiel has this messianic kind of vision about what the future is going to be like, even though that was never actually enacted in biblical times. I'll tell you, I want to talk about love. Can I switch to love for a minute? I would offer two interpretations. Oh, and two hands. Okay, you guys first, especially if we're going to talk about love. Oh, I'm not supposed to get off the BMI now, or without my mask.
This statement, you shall love him as yourself.
Yes.
What is the word that's translated as love? What is that word in the original text?
Ve'ahavta.
Huh?
Ve'ahavta.
And what does that word mean?
You shall love. But
What does that word mean?
In a moment.
What does it mean?
What's behind your question? What are you implying?
Well, this seems to be talking about an internal attitude, an internal act. You shall love him as yourself. I mean, that's quite a statement. And it's not about, give him food or something like that. It's about a real, I'm not sure what the right, but what does ahava mean? What does it mean? What's the linguistic root of that word?
I am up to that. I'm going to answer that question in 1 second. Let's take one more question or comment, and then I promise, Gary, right?
Gary, yes.
Come back to that. Let's take one more question or comment. I promise I'll answer that question.
We make use of the ger. I grew up with the Shabbos goy, and in Israel, on the Jubilee year, they sell their land to the Muslims. So they don't have to follow our exact rules. So we do make use of them.
Before we're all done, I'm going to try to get to modern Israel also and address that topic too. Let me say one or two quick words about understanding what it means to say, love the stranger as yourself, here in Leviticus 19. First of all, you hear those words and it sounds like a more familiar passage, a more familiar verse. Love your what? Love your neighbor as yourself. It took place, it was just 15 sentences earlier than this one. In the same chapter of Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. 15 verses later, it says, and love the stranger as yourself. I have two things I'm going to suggest about what might be going on here. First of all, what's wrong with love your neighbor as yourself? I've asked that question to 7th graders, like in Hebrew school before, and the answer is nothing at all is wrong with that. Well, except for what's love, who's your neighbor, and what if you don't love yourself? But aside from that, it's a perfect statement, right? You can imagine somebody saying, love your neighbor. No problem. I love all of my neighbors, all the people who look like me and think like me and live near me. It's just the people on the other side of town or in the other state or across the ocean who I can't stand and I want to kill. You can picture somebody saying that. I just love my neighbor. So if anybody should think that that's what that verse means, it's not. But if anyone should pervert that verse into thinking that's what it means, 15 sentences later it says, and you should love the stranger as yourself. And I think this is what's called, in pretentious academic language, it's called a merism, which means two extremes, A to Z, soup to nuts, your neighbor and the stranger. It means love everybody in between. That's why they bookend this chapter. The second thing I would say is, and now with Gary's question, what's love? Love in the Torah is a pretty grand concept, but what it's not is, it's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's not, I was thinking of the ger the other day, and I just feel all warm inside. That is not what love the ger means. What it means, and this is not me making this up, this is, I learned from the great 20th century Bible commentators, Dr. Jacob Milgram. I heard him talk about this. He said that anytime you see the word love in the Torah, it implies actions. When we chanted a little earlier in the service, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, love God, it means, because what comes immediately after that verse is, do mitzvot. Here's the actions that you do to express what it means to love God. Love the stranger specifically means do actions that reflect that love by not oppressing the stranger, protecting the stranger's rights, making sure that they're safe, knowing that they're vulnerable, make sure that they're safe, protected, and subject to the same laws as you are. Protect their rights. When you think about it, this makes perfect sense, that love connotes actions. Think about the people in your life who you love. Think about what you want to do for them because of your love for them. Or let me put it in a little bit more harrowing, other kind of way. If someone says they love you, but it doesn't correspond to their actions and behaviors, it would be perfectly understandable if you started to think that maybe they never really loved you in the first place. If they're abusive towards you, they hurt you, or they ignore you in a time of need. So of course, we know intuitively love connotes action. Well, my friends, listen, I've got a lot more, but we have a service to conclude. So I'd like to make one or two more quick points and wrap it up, but we do have another question or comment, so I'd like to hear it.
I was going to say that, my understanding was that no matter how well we know people, everybody is really a stranger. There's parts of people that you can never know. We know people we meet on the outside, but only a small part of them. We may live with them and know more, but there's still parts that we never know, okay? So essentially, everybody is a stranger to themselves and to everybody else that they meet. So the stranger that we don't know really is not too different from the ones we know.
We didn't get to draw out the point that the Torah also repeatedly says, gives a reason for why you're supposed to love the stranger. And I'm aware of the time and that it's Shabbat, and I don't want to go too long, but I do want to point out what else we've got on our page here, that the Torah is going to point us, especially the Torah points us in this direction, and then the rabbis in the Talmud and in the Midrash are going to expand on it. The idea that this love has to translate into empathy, or not translate into, it comes from a place of empathy. Repeatedly, the Torah says, because you were a ger in Egypt, therefore you have to love the ger. Therefore you have to protect the rights of the ger, which is, as we know, there's a very big difference between, say, empathy and sympathy, or pity, or compassion. Sympathy and pity and compassion, I guess those are good human traits to have, when they're necessary. But I've been thinking about this for a long time now, and I keep coming back to the idea about how empathy is in some ways the most human of all emotions that we have. What I mean is that animals don't typically have empathy. Look, I love my dog. I have this fabulous dog. He brought so much love into my house. When I say he doesn't have empathy, is my dog is not overly concerned. We live in Natick. My dog is not overly concerned with the well-being of other dogs in Westwood, you know, let alone dogs in Israel or dogs in Ukraine. I, however, am intensely concerned with the well-being of my friends now in Westwood, let alone in Israel, let alone in Ukraine, because empathy, understanding, being able to relate to another human being is such a human, the most human of emotions. And it doesn't mean we have exactly the same set of experiences. This is a fallacy that I experience on college campus all the time now, that to say, you can't possibly know what I feel. I think I can, at least to a certain extent. I think we can draw connections with other oppressed communities because we can say, I don't know, didn't we learn this from Black Lives Matter, that other people suffer in different ways that we do. But because I've experienced some sort of suffering in my life, I can relate to your suffering 61% at least, or 48%, or 23%. But that's enough for me to be able to treat another person, for us to be able to treat other people with empathy, the most human of emotions. Okay, this is going to be the last comment, and then I'm going to wrap up. Oh, you've got to share an epiphany with us. I can.
So it's almost, so in wrapping this up, that first paragraph that we read when God said to Avram that I foresee I'm going to make it so you're a stranger and you're a slave for 400 years. It almost now seems like God set up the Jewish people to go through that so that we can experience, and through the rest of our lives and our peoplehood, we will be able to have that as our background from which to move forward.
Oh, what's your name?
Sandra.
Sandra, I hope we get a chance to study Torah again in the future because you read me beautifully. You understand exactly that's why we start. That's why Abraham's story starts with that idea that the incubation period of the Jewish people is going to be learning this empathy for every human being, for all people everywhere. And our formation story, you know, is built in that. What just happened? Oh, what does it say? Love, love, love. Somebody said that's all you need. It's in the Torah somewhere, in the back. Okay, here's how I want to wrap up. There's lots of texts we didn't get to, including, I'm sorry, there's a gorgeous text by David Ben-Gurion on page 5 that talks about how this idea, when the Jew, you see, the reason why I have the Zionist text at the back is because what's modern Israel all about? These ideas were theoretical for 2,000 years. When Israel comes into being, it's the first time in 2,000 years we have to say we have created a society that's majority Jewish. Therefore, how do we treat the ger among us in this society that we've built? What does the Torah teach us? And it's laying down a serious gauntlet for what Zionism means. And it should be at the heart, I believe, of every progressive Zionist, this idea of loving the stranger who lives among you. And we know now what love means. So let me end with this. Where does this discussion bring us? Perhaps full circle. The Torah's narratives tell us that being ger is part of the Jewish makeup from the start. We're commanded over and over to defend, protect, support the stranger, even to love them. And this command comes from this place of empathy. You know this story. It's your own, not just, it's your own, just in a new permutation. And I keep thinking about how in just a few weeks we're going to sit down at Passover Seder's in relative comfort and luxury of this place in which we live, where we live as a relatively safe minority in America's tapestry. And we'll take up the matzah at Passover, the lechem oni, this bread of affliction and suffering and poverty. And when you eat the matzah, you're reminded that it's the food we had when we had to leave our homes so quickly without warning. We had to leave so quickly because there was this tyrant pressing and freedom was waiting, but only if we got out right now. Isn't that what matzah is? That's not an elaborate interpretation. It was the bread you eat when you have to leave and don't even have time for it to rise. The Torah says that. And as we anticipate putting the matzah to our lips again, let's remember that this story unfolds all around us every day. As we see the thousands fleeing the Russian aggression, we remind ourselves that the story has been told countless times in the past, and for some people, they have to leave their homes quickly. I'm thinking of the rabbi and his family that had to flee from Ukraine and get miraculously to Tel Aviv. As that story unfolds countless times and in new ways in every generation, we should allow it to move us towards building this world of justice and safety and freedom from fear for us and for everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Papers are all over your bima.
Delicious. Really wonderful to study. Thank you.
Yasher Koach to Rabbi Gold, and thank you so much for teaching this core element of Judaism in such a relevant and timely manner. Please do look in your weekly shofar email for our Sunday session, continuing with our scholar Sunday at 12:30, both in person here or on Zoom. So not live stream, but Zoom. The link is in the email. And thank you again just to our Adult Learning Committee, chaired by Mark Beal, for partnering with us to bring Rabbi Gold this weekend. Shabbat morning, you can continue to celebrate at 9 a.m. with our lay-led minyan. Mark Beal, you're leading, right? Oh, you're not here. Okay. Zoom only, okay?
Zoom only according to Rich, and we do what Rich says.
Okay, and I know the hour is late, but speaking of next Shabbat, since this is a learned crowd here, just a quick Jewish trivia question that has to do with next Shabbat. Can anyone tell us the year of the first bat mitzvah? Selena, what year? Were you going to say that? 100 years ago, next Shabbat. Yes, so next Shabbat, 100-year anniversary of the first bat mitzvah. I will be speaking about that and its significance Friday evening. We also have a baby naming next Friday, the new great-granddaughter of Temple members Lois Beanstalk and Alan Pastor. They are coming from out of state to be here because Lois and Alan wouldn't have it otherwise. So baby naming here with some food and onik for those who would like to stay. So Reopening Task Force has given the green light. And lastly, of course, Purim is coming up this Wednesday evening, 7 to 8. We're inviting adults to join our teen community here with costumes and masks.
You know, Rabbi, I also just wanted to say that Erev Purim this year coincides with St. Patty's Day. So we'll give a little nod to that too, and maybe do a jig or drink a beer.
And Rabbi Micah will be chanting the Megillah in an Irish accent, apparently.
It'll be the Dublin trope system.
He's been waiting since the 1980s from the last
I hope our
overlap.
member John Crichton from Ireland is not watching me tonight, because I'll keep working on it.
And we will continue celebrating Purim next Sunday as well for our families with younger children in Shorashim. Yes, that theme will be the Mandalorian. Okay. Please rise in body or in spirit as we conclude our service, page 282. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol, la'tek edula leotzer breshit, shelo asanu kegoye ha'aratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, v'gor aleinu kechol hamonam, va'anachnu korim, Umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu v'nemar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu Adonai echad ushemo echad. And we take this moment to remember loved ones who are no longer with us. We are especially remembering these loved ones who have passed away in recent weeks. Henry Valois, grandfather of Rob and father-in-law of Liz Watsky. Rachel Glazer, the cousin of Abby Glazer, and Gary Levitt, friend of Tim Holliner. And we remember these loved ones whose yahrzeit, whose anniversary of death occurred this week. Anna Arbor, Albert Backrack, John Gilbert, Genevieve Gontar, Milton Nobler, Mayers Lester, Louise Lieberman, Hyman Raskind, Oscar Rosenberg, Nancy Schesinger, Rena Shapiro. If there are other names that you are remembering, you're welcome to share them. And we join in Mourner's Kaddish, page 294. Yitgadal ve'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divrach chirutei ve'amlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'gala uvizman kariv ve'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam ul'almei almaya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yitale v'yitalal shevedikutra b'richu, le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Zichronam livracha, may their memories be for a blessing. So again, challah and some wine and grape juice will resume next week. Hopefully there's a little oneg for all of you at home. Let's conclude with those last words as we ask God, who makes peace above, to bring peace here amongst all of us and all who dwell with us.
Oseh shalom imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru amen. Oseh shalom imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu. הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן.
Thank you, Howie, for our live stream. Pat, our board rep, all of our helpers tonight. Shabbat Shalom.